This is a bag of drainage gravel. And why do I have a bag of drainage gravel, I hear you ask? Well, I want to use this bag of drainage gravel to talk about extreme fire development. Because at the heart of extreme fire development, there is a concept known as exponential growth. And I'm going to use this bag of drainage gravel to demonstrate that very concept. But first, we're going to talk about linear growth, because as I start to fill up this glass cylinder with small rocks, one at a time, this is an example of linear growth, where eventually I will fill the cylinder with rocks, but it will take a long, boring time to do it, whereby for each revolution of putting rocks in the cylinder, we only gain one more rock in that cylinder. Now, linear growth is very familiar to us. Many of the things in the world around us work by linear growth. If we're walking at a certain speed and we decide to double it, then we'll cover double the distance in the same time. If we pour water into a glass for twice as long, then we'll end up with twice as much. These relationships are linear in nature, and they feel intuitive, familiar, and predictable. But linear isn't the only kind of growth, and in fact, there are quite a few others. But most relevant to us today is exponential growth. Now, to demonstrate that, we're going to start by putting 2 rocks in the cylinder and double it in each revolution, meaning that we start with 2, then 4, then 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, and very quickly you can see that using exponential growth, we're going to fill this cylinder a lot faster than we ever would have using linear growth. And when we look around us in the world, we can find examples of exponential growth. For example, bacteria, where we can see one bacteria divide into 2, then 4, then 8, and so on until we end up with quite literally millions of bacteria in very short periods of time. Now, this concept of exponential growth is possibly more important than you might think, because arguably it's exponential growth and the potential extreme fire behaviour that follows it is one of the main causes for firefighters getting themselves into trouble when we're talking about fire behaviour. Because if we think about linear growth, well, linear growth is generally much slower and much more predictable than exponential growth, where with exponential growth, firefighters could be easily lulled into a false sense of security as they're entering into a building with quite manageable conditions. But as the fire continues to progress towards that exponential growth stage, the conditions inside that building can rapidly change. And this is one of the main challenges around flashover, because as we can see here, a fire can quite easily go from burning in the corner of a room and then transition through to a much larger fire in a very short period of time. But urban fires aren't the only ones that can exhibit this exponential growth-like behaviour, because we can also see it in bushfires or wildfires if you're not Australian, where we can see major blow-up events leading to crown fires and some somewhat arguably extreme fire behaviour. Now, between urban fires and bushfires, there are a lot of very different variables, so to talk about them in one video isn't really the best way of doing it. So in this video, we're going to focus on urban fires, and then I'm going to make another video and release it shortly about exponential growth and extreme fire behaviour in bushfires. But for now, we're going to be talking about urban fires. Now, anytime we're talking about fire behaviour, we can always link it back to the fire triangle, which is a combination of heat, fuel, oxygen, and a chemical reaction. It's also known as the fire tetrahedron. If you happen to be yelling at the screen right now going, hey, that's the tetrahedron, I don't really care. It's a triangle-y thing. Makes the point. So what we've got is heat, fuel, oxygen, and our chemical reaction. And in each of these factors, there can be elements that lean towards exponential growth and elements that lean away from it and will actually inhibit a fire's growth. And so understanding which factors actually aid really rapid fire development and which factors will sort of inhibit that fire development can be really helpful to understand why some fires will behave like they do. Now, we're going to start by talking about heat. And in previous videos, I've explained that when we're talking about heat movement, it's a combination of convection, conduction, and radiation. And while conduction doesn't play the largest part in how structure fires burn, it does play a part. But when we're having a look at the other two, being convection and radiation, those two really do work as a tag team. The convection carries the smoke and all the heat up and away from the fire, and then you have the radiation coming out from the fire itself, but also down from that smoke layer, which is in itself very hot. But one thing I haven't talked about is Stefan-Boltzmann's law. Now, this is quite a technical subject, and when we're talking about Stefan-Boltzmann's law, there's a bunch of things we need to consider. It can't be done in degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit, it has to be done in degrees Kelvin. When we're talking about the way we're looking at it, we really need to convert it from a black body to grey body radiation, because really, when we're talking about flames and smoke, it's more of a grey body than a black body. We also need to consider flame depth, because that will have a huge impact on just like how much radiation is really going to be coming off those flames. And so there's a whole bunch of different variables that need to be considered when we're talking about this law. But in very simple terms, what this law is telling us is that radiation is being produced to the fourth power of the temperature, meaning that for any increase in temperature, there is exponentially more radiation being released by that fire. And so small increases in temperature with the flame or the smoke plume in the convection current can lead to huge amounts of additional radiation coming off that fire. Now, this can have a really significant impact on how the fire is going to behave, because if we look back at our flashover example, we can see that the flame itself is very hot, and the flame temperature will vary greatly depending on the combustion process of anywhere between, say, 600 to 1400 degrees Celsius. And flame temperature is a good indicator of this, but that is only part of the overall picture, because there is also all of that heat and combustion products being pushed up and away by the convection current. And as these products get hotter and hotter, they will emit more and more radiation down on all of the other fuels in the room. And through the process of conduction, we're also going to see the surfaces around that room begin to heat up, and they will also begin to emit radiation as well. And so as we see the fire progress further and further, there will be more and more and more radiation being pushed down on all of the surfaces in that room. And that radiation that's being produced is exponentially more depending on the rise in temperature. And so we can really see how just this law alone really does lean towards exponential fire behavior, because anytime we see a rise in temperature, we get exponentially more radiation coming off that fire as a result. And so this is a really interesting concept when we're thinking about how a fire is going to behave. Now, this brings us to talking about thermal feedback loops, because as the radiation from the fire is being emitted, that heat will then fall upon more fuel sources, and those fuel sources will then begin to heat up. Now, just how quickly they will heat up will vary depending on what those fuel sources are made of, as we're going to see later on in this video. But as those fuel sources heat up, they will begin to pyrolyze, and as they begin to pyrolyze, they will begin to emit more and more flammable smoke. As this smoke is emitted, Eventually, it will reach a concentration in which it can be ignited. When it ignites, this then creates another source of radiation, which feeds more heat into the fuels, which will then pyrolyze and release even more flammable smoke, which can then just allow that smoke to ignite, and the whole process can snowball in a big thermal feedback loop, which sees the fire's growth rate increase more and more. Now that's the heat side of our fire triangle. And when we have a look at the fuel side, ULFSRI really did a great example of how different fuels are going to affect our fire behaviour when they did their legacy fuels versus modern synthetic fuels comparison in a side-by-side flashover cells. Because as we can see here, while the legacy fuels took a very long time to heat up and reach flashover, the modern synthetic materials didn't take very long at all. Now, keep in mind that this is burning with a fully open front, meaning that these fires were able to gain access to a lot of oxygen and also push a lot of the smoke out at the same time to really hold off that effect of ventilation control. And so as a result, this fire was able to go through flashover in a very short period of time. But it's also worth drilling down into this a little bit further because the fuels really have changed and they will also significantly affect just how a fire is going to burn. And we really should start off by having a look at the chemical composition of these fuels. And I'm going to keep it really simple, but when we have a look at the legacy materials, if you have a look at timber, its dry weight, so we've taken the moisture out of the equation, is around about 50% carbon. And then there's some oxygen and some other things in there as well. But essentially, the fuel part of timber is only around about 50% of the dry weight, because that's just how much carbon there is in there as well. I mean, there's also some hydrogen, which does add to the fuel load. But the fuel load in the legacy material of timber isn't the entire fuel source. It isn't the entire weight of the material. And in fact, there's also some oxygen in there, which will help the timber burn more cleanly because the oxygen aids in the combustion process, which makes timber a really nice fuel source when we're standing around a campfire because it can burn nice and cleanly, but it also means that it won't burn with the same amount of heat release as what some of the modern synthetic materials can do, because there are modern synthetic materials that are entirely fuel. Their entire composition is either carbon or hydrogen, or a combination of both, being hydrocarbons, which means that for the entire weight of the material, assuming that there's no moisture, it's all fuel, just all of it's fuel. So pound for pound, the fuel load is much higher than it was before. And this isn't the only part of the picture, because when they burn, the heat of combustion is also higher in a lot of the modern synthetic materials as well. So when they burn, there is more energy being produced, which can then go back into pyrolyzing more of the fuel, which can then turn into more flame, which can then push more heat back into the fuel, and the whole thing can really spiral in this chemical chain reaction. And that's still not the only part of the picture, because where timber needs a reasonable amount of energy to be put into it to get it to pyrolyze, because it has what's known as a higher thermal inertia in comparison to the modern synthetic materials. Now, the modern synthetic materials have what's known as a lower thermal inertia. Now, this means that it requires less heat for that product to heat up to the point where it will begin to pyrolyze. So it actually heats up easier than the timber will, and requires less energy to do it, meaning that it will heat up faster, pyrolyze, catch fire, and then put that energy back in. And once again, we're ending up in this big thermal feedback loop where these materials will burn much easier than the older legacy style materials, which were still, by the way, really flammable. But they're just not as flammable as the modern synthetic materials. Now, this moves us along to mass loss rate, because mass loss rate is the speed at which materials lose their mass as they burn. Usually measured in kilograms per second, a high mass loss rate means the material burns quickly, releasing energy and smoke fast. Many synthetic materials, like polyurethane foam have a high mass loss rate, contributing to rapid fire growth and intense flames. And so now, when we look back at the thermal feedback loop, we can see that all of these factors will significantly influence just how the fire is going to burn. Because if the fuels have a low thermal inertia, this means that they don't require as much radiation to be fed into them before they will begin to pyrolyze. And if those materials are very fuel dense, then this means that there is a lot of carbon and hydrogen that can be released. Now, this coupled with a fast mass loss rate means that a lot of very flammable smoke will be emitted in a very short period of time, which can then catch on fire and feed more heat back into the system, ensuring that our fire can grow much faster than it would have with older legacy-style materials. Now, this is just a really basic look at a few of the things that lead towards exponential growth rather than leading away, because all of these things being, you've got very high fuel content, you've got low thermal inertias and high heats of combustion, they all add towards a fire burning much faster. Whereas the final variable we're talking about is a pretty good example of why these fires can still have really long times to flash over, because when we talk about air or oxygen, this is something that can be really variable in modern fires, because we can see that 3-minute flashover. That's possible, but it doesn't always happen. And I think this message sometimes gets lost, because we can absolutely see a 3-minute flashover in a building, but we can also see a fire reach ventilation control a long time before flashover, and therefore flashover can be delayed for 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes if it happens at all, depending on the availability of the air. Like if a door is actually shut, that may stop a fire reaching flashover altogether. And on top of that, just because a fire has reached flashover, it doesn't mean that it won't go through another stage of flashover in another room or as more ventilation becomes available. And this is clearly demonstrated by having a look at some of the fire development graphs that we see floating around. And a traditional one looks like this one, where we've just got a simple bell curve where we see a fire go through its developing stage, reach flashover, become fully involved, and then go into decay. And this is I still like these graphs because they're just a good way of introducing the concept of how a fire is going to burn. But to be honest, they're probably a little bit inaccurate, and so you need to follow up with another curve that might look a little bit more like this, where the fire will develop, begin to reach flashover, go through a ventilation limited decay stage, and then we may see a window break or a door open or partial structural collapse that allows a different flow path to be established, more oxygen to enter into the room, and then we can see another period of exponential growth. And even this graph is still probably too simplistic. We can actually see many ebbs and flows where we see exponential growth and then a ventilation limited decay stage and then another stage of exponential growth, and a whole range of other factors depending on the complexity of the building. We can also see other factors when we're talking about ventilation controlled fires that will delay that exponential growth, because if the heat release rate has begun to significantly drop, even the addition of air, it will still need to build that heat back up again before it can actually start to really push into that exponential range. Or if we've just got really long distances where the air needs to travel in, down hallways or wherever else, there is still a significant time from when the door is open to when that fire is going to react, just simply because of the logistics, the physics of that air needing to get down that hallway. So there's always a lot more to the picture than just simply, hey, you're going to get a 3-minute flashover. But if the fire has what it needs, if it's got what it needs, if it's got heat, fuel, oxygen, in the right proportions to each other, if you've got the right fuels ready to go and you've got a lot of heat and a lot of fuel and you just need a lot of air, and if you give the fire a lot of air without taking something else away from it, then you can really easily get these periods of exponential growth. And this is when you start talking about why, coordinated ventilation is so important. And I'm a big believer in ventilation. It's an excellent tool on the fire ground, but it's got to be done in a systematic way where you're taking something away from the fire before you give it something. And that's a pretty well accepted kind of thing in firefighting. And I'm not introducing anything new by saying that. That's, coordinated ventilation really is the name of the game for, I think, most countries on the planet. So, yeah, exponential growth in fires. It's a real thing, and it's something that needs to be understood so that we can, better be prepared for it. Just because you're heading down a hallway and it's all dark and you can't see much, doesn't mean that it's not about to reach one of those exponential growth stages. So it's something to keep in mind. And whatever hose technique you're choosing to do, hopefully you're good at it, so you're able to cool the environment. Make sure you control the environment, move forward and get a successful knockdown on that fire and a search and everything else. But that's it for this one. Thank you very much for watching. I will follow up with a video on bushfire. But if you liked it, give it a like. If you've got something to say, drop it down in the comments down below. I really do. I do appreciate everything. Every time people interact with these videos, it's pretty cool. I am just sitting here in my garage talking to myself, essentially. So it's cool when other people, join the conversation. It's not just me. But that's it for this one. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.